Hello and welcome. Thank you very much for taking time this July 4th to join us here at the Notre Dame Global Gateway for this event, the book launch of Commissioner, now Chair of United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, Nury Turkel's book. There are available copies outside, and he will be available afterwards to sign copies. The copies are gratis and sponsored by the Religious Liberty Initiative. I'm delighted to just say a few words. I'm Paul Carey. I'm an advisor on the board for the Religious Liberty Initiative. The two speakers that we have, actually we've got a second book. Dr. Evelina Ochab and Lord Alton have just published state responses to crimes of genocide. I'm just alerting you to that for those of you who are interested. Tomorrow, Dean Cole will be speaking at one of the ministerial fringe events in Parliament in the Attlee Suite of Portcullis House. You're all invited to that, but you do need to have an invitation, and we have several of these just to present at the security entrance. If you're interested, we will have these with the person at the book desk, and if you'd like, we're happy to pass this on to you. One of the other speakers will also be Elder Quentin Cook of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who is here, and I'd like to acknowledge that, and also Professor Stephanie Barclay, who is the director of the Religious Liberty Initiative. She'll be speaking on one of the recent cases on the Apaches of Oak Flat and her Harvard Law Review article. Now, Professor Barclay is going to come and continue with the introductions. May I also add, by the way, because she'll be too modest to say this, she's the new Clarendon Scholar, one of the Clarendon Scholars at the University of Oxford, who will be starting her DPhil, her doctorate there in law this coming year. So congratulations.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you to all of you for joining us for this exciting book discussion. Thank you to members of our Board of Advisors for the Religious Liberty Initiative who are here. The Dean is going to properly introduce our two speakers, so I won't say too much about Commissioner Turkel and Lord Alton, other than what great friends and defenders of freedom they both are, and how fortunate we have felt with our Religious Liberty Initiative to be able to advance the important causes that they both fight for freedom of people of all faiths, and in particular for the Uyghur community that is struggling in China. This is something that is particularly important in the Religious Liberty Initiative that Notre Dame advances, and that is to take ideas in academia and theories and important concepts and then leverage them in the real world to make a difference in the lives of people who are suffering and who are facing persecution. And I can't think of better examples of champions who do that than Commissioner Turkel and Lord Alton. So please join me in giving them both a round of applause. Our Religious Liberty Initiative is made possible because of the vision of our dean at Notre Dame Law School, Dean Marcus Cole, who has had the vision and the commitment to make this program possible. He's, I think, one of the deans in the country, in the United States, who cares about this most and who also wants to expand some of these operations more internationally. With that, I'll turn the time over to him to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Paul. And thank you all for being here. As Stephanie said, I'm Marcus Cole. I'm the Dean of Notre Dame Law School. And this Religious Liberty Initiative was just a dream 3 years ago. And in the 2.5 years since we established it, it has now become one of the largest structures for the defense in the fight of the protection of religious freedom around the world. And we started very small with just a handful of students, and Professor Stephanie Barclay is our director, and now we are established as one of the leading law school clinics in the United States fighting for religious freedom in the Supreme Court of the United States and the courts around the United States. And next year, we will begin to branch outside of the United States with our first international clinic based here in our London facility in Trafalgar Square. So I'm grateful that you get to see this place as one of the places where we're going to continue the fight for religious freedom. And I'm deeply honored that as we take the fight for religious freedom, both in the United States and around the world, that we have with us today two of the leaders in that fight. Commissioner Nury Turkel and Lord David Alton. Nury Turkel is an attorney, a foreign policy expert, and a rights advocate with nearly 2 decades of experience working in the intersection of law, business, and government, and the Human Rights community. He specializes in corporate governance and regulatory compliance, national security, foreign policy, digital authoritarianism, and forced labor and supply chain risk issues. He's currently serving as the chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom after being appointed as a commissioner by Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi in May of 2020. He testified before the U.S. Congress speaking about Uyghur internment camps and advocating a legislative response to China's atrocities. His policy recommendations have been incorporated into U.S. laws and pending bills relating to Uyghurs in China. As a rights advocate, he's led efforts to raise the profile of the Uyghur cause, previously as president of the Uyghur American Association and now as chair of the Uyghur Human Rights Project, which he co-founded in 2003. He also advised past and present leadership of the World Uyghur Congress. He is a senior fellow at a Washington think tank, the Hudson Institute, where he works on U.S. foreign policy and national security issues. He is also a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and in 2020, he was Time Magazine's 100 most influential people in the world list, and in 2021, he was listed as one of Fortune's 50 greatest leaders. In June 2021, we were deeply honored as the Religious Liberty Initiative of the University of Notre Dame to award Nury Turkel the Notre Dame Prize for Religious Liberty. His interlocutor tonight will be Lord David Alton of Liverpool. For 18 years, from 1979, David Alton was a member of the House of Commons, and in 1997 was appointed as an independent member of the House of Lords. He's married with 4 children, and he's the author of 11 books. Lord Alton is a professor at Liverpool Hope University and formerly a professor of citizenship at Liverpool John Moores University. He's co-founder of the Jubilee Campaign, a recipient of the Thomas More Award for Religious Freedom, a former board member of Aid to the Church in Need, and in 2019, he was presented with a State Department award for his work on human rights by Ambassador Sam Brownback. He is co-chair of the all-party parliamentary groups on North Korea, Eritrea, and Pakistan minorities. He is also vice chair of the APPGs for FORB, Burma, Tibet, and Uyghurs, and a member of the House of Lords International Relations and Defense Select Committee. In 2021, he was sanctioned by the Chinese Communist Party following his successful legislative campaign on genocide determination. In 2022, he co-authored a book on genocide. In Parliament, he has successfully campaigned for the sanctity of human life, human rights, and religious freedom. His motto on his coat of arms is taken from the book of Deuteronomy: choose life full. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Nury Turkel and Lord David Alton.
Well, thank you, Marcus. I hope my obituary reads as well as that. Full of nice things, thank you. And thank you particularly to Notre Dame for their religious freedom, their religious liberty initiatives, which I've seen firsthand when I visited the campus as your guest back in February. And I am full of admiration for what you're doing. It's a great boost to us in the UK, and it's a great boost to many people who are suffering deprivations of their religious freedom. Nury and I said to him when we saw each other this evening, we can't go on a meeting like this. We shared a platform only last week in Washington at the summit there. And on that platform that evening, we had, on either side of us, we had a young woman Maryam Ibrahim, who some of you will recall her story. She had been arrested for so-called apostasy and blasphemy. She had been sentenced to 100 lashes and then to death. And she gave birth shackled in a prison cell in Sudan. It was someone whom I'd campaigned for at the time, and it was an extraordinary privilege to be with her as we were sharing a platform also with a bishop, Bishop Jude, who just come from Nigeria, and from the very area, indeed in his own diocese, where 40 people had been murdered in the Church of St. Francis just a couple of weeks ago. And one of the issues that brought us together on the platform that night was the case of Leah Sharibu. Again, some of you will know her case. She was abducted, she was raped and impregnated, and attempts were made to forcibly convert her. Why do I tell you these stories? Because they are about Article 18. They're about religious freedom. They're about the sort of work that the Commissioner is now doing. They're about what brings us, I hope, together tonight. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights brought wise people together, many from the English-speaking world, from both sides of the Atlantic, and crafted an extraordinary document, 30 articles. Article 18, though, is often a forgotten article. It's an orphaned right, the right to believe, the right not to believe, and the right to change your belief. And all of those things are denied, of course, to the Uyghur people in Xinjiang. I've read No Escape. I got my copy last week, and in between my travels and coming down from Liverpool today, Marcus and I have Liverpool in common as well, because he has family there, a very wise thing to do. It's the centre of the universe. And coming down this morning on the train, I was able to read those parts I hadn't got to. It is a remarkable book, and I really can recommend it to you. Nury, we're going to do this through mainly Q&A, so as to try and bring out some of the things that are in the book. But I'd just say at the outset that for me this is like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag literature, because this is the account of someone, and it's where I want to start with the questions this evening, who was born in one of these camps. So your personal story really matters. It reminds me also of Anne Frank's diaries, and also Corrie ten Boom's wonderful book, The Hiding Place. She was arrested for hiding Jewish people during the Holocaust. But she was also taken to a work camp where she was forced to work, as her sister was. Her sister died in that camp. And even some of the companies that were using forced labour in those very camps are accused of exploiting forced labour in Xinjiang today, including Siemens. So those kinds of books are books that I've always treasured, and yours will sit comfortably alongside them because it's well written, but it's not just about you. That's the second thing I want to talk about, which is about Article 18. It's about the abuse of human rights and all the things that we've just been mentioning, and even genocide, the crime above all crimes. And it's very good for me to see Dr. Ohab here this evening, and thank you, Paul, for mentioning the publication of our book this week. Let me start then with you. Tell me, and the audience I know will want to know a little bit about you, the human being, Nury, being born in the camp, being brought up in it, re-education camps. Now, Mao Zedong had done this in the Cultural Revolution. We all know the stories about what happened to people who'd fallen out of favour with the party, but this isn't just people falling out of favour with the Chinese Communist Party, this is a whole people. Tell us a bit about that.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. Let me begin by congratulating you and Evelina on the book, much needed book that people need to read, to be reminded of state parties' treaty obligation under the Genocide Convention. Thank you. Congratulations. And I wanted to thank you for leading the effort in the UK to raise awareness early on when this issue was not as well known, as popular as today. And I also wanted to thank my Notre Dame colleagues, Dean Marcus, Cole, Stephanie. You've been amazing friends and supporters to me, and I can't thank you enough to you and your colleagues. I also can't miss the opportunity to welcome my new colleagues at USERF, Commissioners Schneck and Yulin. It's hard to talk about foreign policy when Commissioner Yulin sits in the audience, was number two, most high-level official who handled human rights and diplomacy in the previous administration. Also my colleague Dwight from USERF. And also wanted to acknowledge the Uyghur community here with us. I admire their resilience and campaigning, educating the people in UK of the ongoing Uyghur genocide. And finally, the gentleman sitting over there is my UK publisher. He's been amazing.
Never forget our publishers.
Yes. He writes extremely well, and he's a tough editor. So my life has been both fulfilling and tragic in many ways. Many of my friends did not even know that I was born in a re-education camp during the height of Cultural Revolution. Who would think that it is necessary to talk about some sad stories and bitter memories? But starting in 2018, actually I started here in this town when I did my first BBC Hard Talk interview. I shared with the world that I was born in Mao's re-education camp. And my mother was a newly wedded pregnant woman who was taken to the camp. She went through a lot of physical, emotional torture. And while this was happening, my father was in a labor camp in an area 3 hours away from Kashgar. And I found that this to be told for two reasons. One, this is what the international community wake up to or about to learn is not something new. This has been an ongoing repression with a different name, different tactics, different justifications. And also I want the international community to know that the slave labor is also not something new. My dad, the university-educated professor, educator, was sent to perform agricultural labor. And now it's been extremely painful and costly work. Like you, I got sanctioned by Communist China last December. 6 other commissioners who served in the commission alongside me also sanctioned. In May, I found out that my name wasn't included Putin's sanction list as well. So I have been sanctioned by 2 of the worst human rights abusers in the world. About 3 months ago, I lost my father. And the last time I saw him was in late 2015, briefly in Turkey. He's been ill. He died at the age of 83. But I was in the neighborhood in Central Asia when I heard the news. I was in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, which is the same distance between New York and Washington. And yet I cannot go there, hold my mother, and carry my dad's casket. And I haven't seen my mother, as I described in the book, since my law school graduation in 2004. So let that think in. You just try to be a normal human being. Go about with your life. Go about with your professional career. Go about with your hobby. I, like most of you here, have hobbies that I cannot even spend time to do the things that I used to do. So on the positive side, through sharing my stories and that of other people's stories that I describe in the book and other forms, we've made some progress with your help and the help of the others in the United States. So I am pleased with the progress that we made, but we have to be reminded of a brutal fact that the genocide is still underway.
And your own family, one of the things that always strikes me from the Uyghurs whom I've met in London is their fear of speaking, even though they do speak and put themselves on the line, but they worry so much about their family and the people they've left behind. Is that something that's affected you?
The transnational repression, that's the terminology that the United States government uses, including a recent visa restriction imposed on several Chinese officials, specifically addressed this problem, not only those in the UK, but also in the United States. I am one of them. The Chinese authorities will not allow my mother to leave China to meet her American-born grandchildren. My case is actually concerning others are much more manageable. But what we're talking about is the individuals, as you met, as you learn about, who have family members in a camp, and yet because of fear of reprisal by the communist regime in Beijing, they cannot even publicly to advocate on behalf of their missing family members. And the governments around the world are not doing anything to help.
Tell us a bit about what re-education involves, because it sounds as though this is just a different version of primary school, but of course it isn't. It's very fundamental. It's about the way that you see yourself, your religious beliefs, how you even see the structure of family life.
The re-education, in essence, is the atheist education. The communist regime inherently anti-religion. So the Uyghur people's religious identity, ethnic identity, way of life, including those practice Christianity, Buddhism, have always been perceived as a threat to the communist regime, has always been perceived as a source of potential unrest. has also been perceived as a sign of disloyalty. So this re-education is about what they've been using in an innocuous term, in sense, is to destroy the Uyghur religious practices, the Uyghur belief. So when you look at the method that they use on daily basis in those camps, as I described through my interview with the camp instructors and camp survivors, so essentially they will recite and repeat, "Who is your new God, Xi Jinping?" And it had to put up with a lot of offensive language, maligning the religious belief. In some instances, they engage in sexual violence, and when that were happening, they're saying, "Why don't you call your God?" So this is in a purposeful, deliberate way to destroy the Uyghurs' centuries-old ethno-religious identity.
Certainly, even when I first visited Western China and I went on into Tibet, I saw beautiful mosques in Western China, and I met people from Muslim backgrounds, and I've seen reports subsequently of how minarets have been removed, the imams have been replaced. Everything has been changed fundamentally in a way, but when you think about the coexistence that existed in that part of China previously, it seems to be a completely retrograde step. I don't think everyone realizes that not everyone, though, who are caught up in these things is necessarily Muslim. In some of the Turkic communities, I met a couple, for instance, last week in Washington who would be Kirkic, and they had been in the camps as well and had escaped. And I was very moved to hear their story. Do we not need to hear a little bit more about that side of things as well?
Absolutely. In spring 2017, the Chinese local legislative entity in Urumqi put out something called de-extremification measure, which essentially criminalized 48 behaviors. That includes growing beard, adherence to certain religious practices, even diet, even encouraging family members
forcing people to eat pork.
Yes, and then abstention, and also including things like encouraging your family, your daughter and son, to marry people from your own community. That sort of stuff. This was published in one of the major publications in the United States, the translated version. It is so draconian. Every aspect, regardless, as long as you perceived or caught up in the government data buildup through integrated joint operating platform that Human Rights Watch reverse engineered, you passed writing, travel history, social engagements, speaking, even in some instance, soccer players practicing soccer in some countries, stage performers singing some songs, some lyrics might be objectionable or considered toxic by the individuals who are analyzing, scrutinizing those lyrics. So everyone, as long as that you're Uyghur, you're right. This is not exclusively to the Uyghur Muslims. This is happening across the board. We should not also forget the other Turkic people, the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz and the Uzbek. Thank God that there's some Kazakh camp survivors have provided public testimonies. Now we know that they've also been heavily affected. We haven't heard enough about the Uzbek Muslims, the Kyrgyz people in China.
What about things like birth rates? And we've seen Professor Adrian Zand's work, for instance, on the discrepancies that have emerged in the levels of reproduction, the numbers of children now being born, and as an indicator, a technical indicator of genocide rather than a rhetorical use of that word. That was one of the reasons why Jeffrey Nice QC in the Independent Uyghur Tribunal that met here in London, I was there for the judgment, it was one of the reasons why he decided this is technically a genocide. And of course he's a man who knows a thing or two about these things. He was the prosecutor in the Milosevic trials, for instance. Is that something, and also the destruction of identity that you've mentioned goes further. We've heard some reports, for instance, of the destruction of cemeteries and graveyards. Is that something you know about?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. When the United States government issued that statement, officially recognizing the atrocities as genocide, when you carefully look at it, the focus essentially on two issues. One, forcible removal of Uyghur children from their families and transfer them into another group. What we're talking about is more than the people who live in the District of Columbia, our nation's capital. We have about 750,000 people. Based on New York Times reports, there there are anywhere between 800,000 to 1 million Uyghur children have been transferred into state orphanage. And some of those pictures were released in latest BBC Revelation. There are some young kids wearing oversized clothes, shaved, as young as 13, as old as 73. So this was one key and the most disturbing aspect of what I have been able to learn and educate the world about. And the other aspect is a systematic, deliberate violence against Uyghur women through forced sterilization and gang rape and sexual violence, all forms of sexual violence, as been told by camp survivors. I included some of it. Some of it even more, it's so graphic to be even publicly discussed. We have a camp survivor, Tursunay Ziauddin in Washington. She went so much in details in one of her interviews, I could not even continue to read it. And then through forced sterilization, they're even targeting women who are in their middle age, like over 50, who had no plan to conceive. So in one of the individuals that I interviewed told me that she was forced to go through sterilization. This is how brutal, and as a result, there's a significant population, decline in the natural population growth. So United States government, in a bipartisan spirit, both previous administration and current administration recognized that this is a genocide. And also the other aspects, in whole and part, purposefully destroying this ethno-national group is another. So every legal requirement for a genocide has been established.
I mean, Nury, let's go deeper in a moment into the definition of what is underway, whether this is genocide, crimes against humanity, or whether it's merely violations of human rights. Instead of going there first, though, let's just go with what has happened in China over the distance. I mean, the CCP was responsible, it's said, for perhaps as many as 50 million people's deaths. Julia Lovell's book on Maoism, for instance, I think is again a stunning read, and there are others too. Leopards don't change their spots. I mean, given what we see they've done in Hong Kong, the threats that are made on a daily basis to Taiwan, what they did in Tibet, what is happening now, and let alone the restrictions on free speech or anyone wanting to probe things like, for instance, the origins of COVID-19. Shenzhen, for instance, young woman, citizens, journalist, lawyer who's in prison, best part of 4 years already, for daring to go and probe the state's role in what may have been an accident, but what may have been deliberate, but trying to uncover the truth. What's it like living in that kind of society where, regardless of whether you're a Uyghur or not, I mean, what is that? What's the contrast? I mean, you're a lawyer as well by background. You chose to uphold law as your profession. You live in a country like the United States. I mean, what's the difference between these kind of societies?
In my book, I cited a Chinese author who essentially likened China in a society combination of North Korea and the United States. It is North Korea, and it's in a way the government using various tactics to surveil, control, and even scare. So people made a conscious decision not to criticize, look the other way, just act ignorantly. And some of those people who are affected have been speaking out, including this author who used to be one of the most wealthy people in China. And the other group is being able to post video messages in TikTok, being able to travel around the world for shopping in Paris, shopping in New York. And they chose to also not to speak out because it's too costly for them financially. So this government, this regime, has created this weird environment, a strange living environment. As for the Uyghurs and other oppressed religious and ethnic minorities, United States is right in calling it as an open-air prison. Every aspect of your life. I mean, this recent episode in Shanghai is riveting. They managed to lock down 190 million people based on a very conservative estimate. That is about 1/3 of the Chinese workforce. And those in inland China, in big cities, who feel indifferent about the Chinese surveillance, Chinese repression, might be having a second thought now. Because whatever happened to the Uyghurs and Tibetans and the Christian community, Catholics for example, might be there tomorrow. So anyone who's living in Xi Jinping's China can no longer ignore this repressive regime that is so insecure, that spends more money on domestic security than national defense.
In 1988, I traveled to the former Soviet Union. I was in Ukraine that particular year and saw the protests on the streets and the suffering that people were enduring. But if you told me that within a year I'd see the collapse of the Soviet Union, I would have said, well, hopefully in my lifetime. But it all happened much more quickly than we imagined. Are you saying that given what's been happening in Shanghai with the lockdowns, given this determination to become president for life, the banning of any memorials, for instance, in Hong Kong to commemorate Tiananmen Square, the repression of any pro-democracy people, the threats constantly being made to Taiwan, do you think all that is building up to some similar outcome, or is that too much to hope for?
I am hopeful. Just looking around, specifically in Washington, there are a momentum building up. There are consensus. If you look at the way that U.S. Congress function, even an executive branch's approach to China, it's very similar. In any legislative actions taken in Congress, has been overwhelming support. In a couple of instances, there's only one congressman from Kentucky. He always votes against anything comes their way. But everyone else is in unison taking a similar position, which is unthinkable. It's hard to find another matter in Washington today that unifies the people as much as it has when it comes to China, Hong Kong, Uyghurs, and Taiwanese issues. So that's a positive sign. But what is missing is broader recognition of the threat, whether it be an ideological front, whether it be on the diplomatic autocracy versus democracy, whether it be in a technological aspect. Chinese technology, surveillance technology, as I describe in the book, I have a chapter, is all everywhere. It's already a fact of life for us. Hikvision, for example, recently been profiled. And this might be disturbing to you. Last December, the Biden administration added a Chinese military and medical academy and its 11 affiliates to the entity list, Commerce Department's blacklist, for developing brain-controlled weaponry. And this is the regime that the international community tried to go about business as usual. And then on the value issue, it shouldn't take a genocide in the Uyghur homeland, destruction of Hong Kong democracy, and the daily threat against Taiwan to wake up the international community. It's positive development, but I can't think of any government that has put out a coherent, a long-lasting policy agenda. It's all been experimental. There's a healthy debate in Washington these days. And I reject the notion that this is about geopolitical purpose. That the United States government is creating this problem. There's some people, and some reasonable people in some think tanks, believe that this is in the making by somebody in the previous administration or somewhere in the US government, which is false. This has been demonstrated in the current administration. Some of the people serving in the Biden administration are not known as China hawk. But as soon as they start reading intelligence briefing, their mind is changing. So I hope this will be the norm in other countries. But I stop after this. The Chinese Communist Party ruled Chinese government already made up their mind. In the last 50 years, they have been extremely consistent and effective, saying they are in constant battle against Western influence, meaning freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, all of the things that we value, we thrive based on, are something problematic to the Chinese, whereas our approach has been transactional. Oh, we need to get this ABCD done. The climate crisis is one good example. So there's a lot of misunderstanding. It seems that CCP has figured us out, and yet we have not been fully appreciate their ultimate goal.
Certainly, as you say, there is now a more bipartisan and certainly transatlantic response to China, unlike anything I've seen previously. But even as back in 2019 in the States, I attended the first big ministerial there, which of course is being replicated here this week, and I was very struck that Sam Brownback interviewed Nancy Pelosi and Frank Wolf, Democrat and Republican, and they could have been singing from the same hymn sheet even then. And it's got to be said also that, of course, the outgoing Secretary of State and the incoming Secretary of State, reflecting the views of the incumbents, have both said there is a genocide underway in Xinjiang. Now, I want to ask you more about this because in the United Kingdom, we've pressed on this issue, and I introduced amendments, as Marcus mentioned earlier on, to the trade bill on this subject. We have no mechanism for determining what is a genocide because we say it's simply a matter for the courts, knowing that there is no UK court that's empowered to do this, and it's never going to be referred to the International Criminal Court because guess what? That requires a Security Council decision, and China's on the Security Council would veto it. So it's a piece of baloney when they say this. However, we did have the former Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, having looked at the evidence, describe in terms, he said, what is happening in Xinjiang is on an industrial scale, and given that he comes from a Jewish family with direct Holocaust experience, he said he never believed that he would see anything like this in his lifetime. His successor, Liz Truss, goes further and has said this is a genocide, but her own department refuses to say so. The House of Commons has said this is a genocide, and they voted for a motion accordingly. But the government says it can't say that because the courts haven't so determined. Meanwhile, that of course lets countries like this off the hook in terms of the 1948 Convention on the Crime of Genocide, which requires us to prevent, to protect, and to bring punishment to those responsible. And since Bosnia, it also requires us to predict when a genocide may be emerging. So given all of those things, what more can we do to push this up the agenda so that when you get the United Nations' own High Commissioner on Human Rights going to Xinjiang and coming away saying, oh, well, it's not very good, but there may be some human rights violations, and then resigning not long after, what does that tell us about the state of international institutions and what we maybe need to do?
Thank you. That's a great question. There are a number of issues, as you know, as has been discussed. One is the lack of coherent policy responses. As you and I know, expressing concern, even making public statement is not a strategy. What is the strategy? What is the plan? Why this genocide is still underway? It's been 6 years. Why can't we do the same thing as we did in response to Putin's invasion of Ukraine? In less than a week, a significant number of global businesses either stopped their business practices or suspended.
Yeah.
And why can't have one company in the United States even acknowledge the CECC hold a hearing several months before the Genocide Olympics? There was the CEOs of major companies, the sponsors of the Genocide Olympics. None of them even acknowledge there is a problem in China. I mean, what does it say about us as a society, as a civilization? It's serious, serious problem. And that kind of recognition is necessary, and also we need to be a little bit more bold. When it's costly, you don't say anything. When it's not costly, you're allowed. I'll give you one example. UN Secretary General Guterres, to this day, has not said anything openly, publicly, as his job is required under the UN mandate. And yet he goes to Ukraine, standing in front of a bomb building, and says all the right thing because it's not costly for him to call out Russia. It's extremely costly for him to call out CCP. That is wrong, immoral. And Michelle Bachelet, she does not appear to be even aware of her own job description. Her job description does not say that she needs to go to Beijing to engage diplomatic relationship. Her job is to investigate. She miserably failed and also came back echoing the Chinese propaganda. And that's an insult to those millions of people who are languishing in the industrial scale concentration camps and those victims around the world looking for their missing family members. So we have to look into the ways. I know you and I believe there's a serious problem in international law, the system that people often talk about, Article 2. Article 1 is equally important.
Yep.
So if you sign on something, you have to fulfill your treaty obligation. Yep. So if the existing system doesn't work, we need to come up with something else. Otherwise, we'll keep seeing genocide. International community have already seen 3 genocidal known actions: Yazidis, Rohingya Muslims, and the Uyghurs. We may see more if we don't do anything about it.
Winston Churchill, describing the horrors of Auschwitz and of the Holocaust, said that this was a crime so awful that it didn't even have a name. And it took a Polish Jewish lawyer, Raphael Lemkin, of course, to create the word genocide and then to create the convention. But there is no doubt that this has fallen into dereliction in many respects. That in your book you say, this is about never again, that slogan, and making it real, because never again happens too often all over again. You've got some very moving chapters. I mean, you mentioned the position of women, and I thought the chapter on the plight of Uyghur women was profoundly moving. You also have a chapter on slave labour, and I want to take you back to that again for a moment, if I may, because William Wilberforce, the great British parliamentarian, he was the youngest member of the House of Commons, people often attribute to him the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and then slavery itself. It actually took 40 years, and as much as I admire deeply William Wilberforce, it was a great alliance that was created. In fact, it was a group of women, Quaker women, who founded the committee. I've got a poster on my wall at home that says, "God so loved the world, he did not send a committee." But we all know that in politics and academic life and everywhere else, that if you want to do anything, you have to form alliances with people, you have to form committees. And they created an extraordinary alliance of people who came together. And in fact, the UK and emerging United States affected one another, and legislation, minds were changed, hearts were softened, and there was change. But as you said, there's an extraordinary sort of blind spot, because perhaps, follow the money. There's a blind spot when it comes to big corporations and their view about Xinjiang and the legitimacy of buying commodities, cotton-made goods, but a lot of other things too. So we'll come back, if we made a Hikvision and the surveillance technology and the role that plays, but also where the purchases of that still in the United Kingdom, unlike the United States. But let me ask you specifically, I think it was 86 major corporations have been identified as being in the supply chains coming out of Xinjiang. And during the Genocide Olympics, we saw the names of some of them. Is there any sense of guilt on their parts that they go on making money, profiteering on the backs of Uyghur slave labor?
That doesn't appear to be the case. As you mentioned, never again. Let me remind the audience, in 1945, American chief prosecutor at Nuremberg, Robert Jackson, said never again. Yep. We failed on that promise. It is happening in real time today. When you look at the names of those companies sponsored the Genocide Olympics, you will be surprised to see same company names that have been implicated in slave labor practices. Even during the process of legislating the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, some of those companies, as reported in the New York Times, tried to stop the bill. Last December, there was a public campaign essentially forcing the businesses and administration officials to either say they're for slave labor or against slave labor. And it worked. And the US Congress legislated that important piece of legislation that perhaps is the most significant, important legislative mandate put in place to address some of the lingering issues in the US-China trade. If fully implemented, it will be a good start, a good beginning, but I don't think it will be able to resolve the issue, which is to clean out the global supply chain of slave labor-produced products. This has to be a global effort. This bill is important. When the United States speak out or taken bold actions, sky did not fall on us. I think the European nations, specifically major powers like Germany and French government needs to step up. They need to do more. They know exactly how it ends when a regime collectively punish a vulnerable ethno-religious group. And we've seen this movie before. For the businesses, I think businesses and as well as entities that have been complicit in this kind of atrocity crimes, there got to be accountability. When the International Olympic Committee ignored a call to relocate the Genocide Olympics. That's like a very basic, simple. They used the COVID to postpone the Summer Olympics. They even did not want to listen to it. So how do we hold them to account? That is one area that I think legislators need to look into.
Certainly the American legislation is impressive, and we've got amendments similar to that running through the procurement bill, which is currently before the British Parliament, and we're a group of us cross-party, cross both houses, Conservative, Labour, Liberal Democrat, Independents like me. I mean, we have worked together on this, and so I'm drawing a parallel with what you described before. But as much as we're all keen and enthusiastic to do that, consumers themselves have a role here.
Yes.
And I don't think we make it very easy for consumers. I decided to buy some stuff recently in a toy shop for my grandchildren. I kept on asking the assistant, is there anything that isn't made in China? And it didn't even say made in China on the goods, it said PRC. And if you didn't know what PRC was, you would think it was just a product straight off the shelf that had been made by an ordinary company. Fortunately, they found some things from Taiwan and India, which I then bought. But my point really is this, Nury. Unless goods are marked, these goods may have been made in a country committing genocide, which would certainly be true in the case of China. The average consumer is not really in a position to have the knowledge to be able to take ethical decisions. And how are we going to make it easier for them to do so? Because reverting again to what I said about the slave trade, I mean, the sugar boycotts that ordinary people began up and down this country was a major factor in changing the minds of legislators. They saw that their constituents, as it were, cared deeply about this and wanted something done about it. And finally, there was a worldwide reaction. I mean, there was, amusingly, because this is all a very serious conversation, but I was at least amused that when China rather stupidly decided that because the Australians had said there should be an inquiry into Wuhan, that they boycotted Australian wine. Well, British consumers were very happy to pick up the tab, and Australian wine hadn't sold so many bottles in this country for a very long time. And I don't think that was a calculation Beijing had made. But my serious question, how can we enable consumers to get behind what you're saying should be a worldwide campaign? If there's a worldwide campaign on environmental issues, on climate change, on all these things, why isn't there a worldwide campaign on the genocide in Xinjiang?
You're raising an important point. I think it has been also proven to be effective. Early this year, as you may recall, there was a campaign to not to watch the Genocide Olympic. And that campaign really worked. NBC and Canadian CBS reported nearly 50% drop in their viewership. That is a big loss for those media organizations. And the same can be done on the consumer products. For example, 20% of the world's cotton products are sourced in the Uyghur homeland. 80% of China's cotton products are sourced in the Uyghur homeland. That tells you how serious this problem is, and also how much it can be effective. Next time when you go to H&M, next time when you go to Costco, Target, Walmart, if you see something made in China, please put it back. That way the investors, that way the corporate boardrooms will hear from you. The power of consumer activism cannot be understated, particularly in the United States. And also, we should be mindful that we maybe end up paying a little bit more down the road, but it's the right thing to do. We don't want to be complicit in the slave labor, modern day slave labor. One industry that need to be extremely careful is the battery and solar panel. You need to be reminded of this brutal fact, which is China uses dirty coal and slave labor to make solar panels. And we cannot compete with that kind of industry that uses modern day slavery. And the notion that it takes 10 years for the United States to catch up with the Chinese solar panel industry is not true. A country that were able to come up with a vaccine, 3 different types of vaccines in 10 months, could manage to pull this off. And it's just not a true statement. So there are a lot of misinformation is floating around, and some climate activists actually promoting this idea that if you don't criticize CCP, then they will cooperate in climate crisis and they will behave. That's not true. CCP does what is good for the party and what is good for the leadership.
That's very helpful. So let's get back then to the issue of surveillance, because a lot of surveillance equipment comes out of Xinjiang, and you specifically mentioned Hikvision, and there's a chapter in the book around this subject. It's one that I've been raising again and again in the House. Hikvision is banned in the United States. It is not banned here. Why isn't there cooperation between Five Eyes allies in identifying threats to security? Ironically, there are over 1 million Hikvision cameras in the United Kingdom now. In our local government, in national government offices. Ironically, they were the cameras that were used when the former Secretary of State for Health was caught on cameras in his own department in an unfortunate embrace. He lost his job as a consequence. His successor has stripped out the Hikvision cameras from the Department of Health. Very wise too, but why not from every hospital in the country? Why not from all our public buildings and outlets? Why are we still importing Hikvision technology when they don't just make the stuff there, but they also, of course, are the leading purveyors of surveillance of a surveillance regime in hand with the authorities in Xinjiang. Talk us through that a bit.
So the Chinese surveillance technology is something that the international community has failed to pay attention to. We might be a little too late because based on a recent testimony that at a hearing that Yusuf organized, one of the experts told us that at least 83 countries, this was about a year and a half ago, already adopted, or in the process of adopting Chinese surveillance. The Chinese surveillance is not the type of surveillance that the international community has known to. Some people during the COVID was mesmerized and praising China for the contact tracing. That is not permanent. Can you imagine that the government will monitor, surveil your communication through cameras in your places of worship, at your private homes, schools, and hospitals? Hikvision is a good example. In the United States, until it was discovered by the previous administration, one military installation in the U.S., all of our hospitals, all of our schools, prisons, and U.S. Embassy in Kabul was using Hikvision cameras. Yes. So it's asinine. It's unbelievable that we did not know or looked the other way. And the other aspect is very important, which is these tech firms are government. It's a Chinese state. In the book that I reference in my own book, we have been harmonized by a German reporter, K. Strittmatter, had a chance to visit one of those tech firms, iFlyTech. So he enters the lobby, it says, "We rule China today, we will rule the world tomorrow." That's their slogan. And also on the desks of the CEOs of those companies and red phone directly connected to the CCP leadership. So there's a direct line of communication. So anyone in the United States even tried to suggest that any politician, anyone tried to politicize this, need to do some fact checking. So this is a real serious problem. This is threat, Chinese surveillance techniques, a threat to civil liberties, religious liberties, and democratic norms.
Nury, I've got one more question, and then I'm going to ask members of the audience if you've got things you'd like to quickly come in on as well, because there is a bit of time to do that. But I want to ask you two things about the book itself. What do you hope it will achieve? And secondly, what's in the English edition that you weren't able to put in the US edition? Because I know that there are some differences.
The cover is different. My publisher was insisting that I should not have my face on the cover of the book. Well, he rather would like to have that mask to illustrate the Uyghur struggle. The fact that the Uyghurs have not been able to escape. The mask is very illustrative image. The book, the content is essentially the same. So the UK version get more citations for a reason that we need to be able to cite the source of the thing, specifically on the business. We wanted to be able to, I can say, but because I'm happen to be Uyghur, sometimes it just raises a natural question, like, oh, he's saying it because he's Uyghur. So I wanted to be more, cite more resources for the things that came into the book. And then what would be my hope takeaway? The reason I named the book No Escape, in addition to the reasons that I described, I want the readers to feel they cannot escape this issue. This is about our future. If the products that we use at home, the baby pajamas that we make our kids to wear, the solar panels put on our rooftop, or beauty products that are sold in African American community as black gold, is made by, produced by, or as a result of somebody's real hair, then this is our problem. So no one can say, I did not know. No one can say that I can go about business as usual. No one can continue to kowtow to CCP leadership. No one can continue to tell us that the engagement is the way to go with the Beijing. I think that's the takeaway that I hope to achieve from my readers.
Well, that's an excellent summary. I mean, I think it was Dietrich Bonhoeffer who famously said that you can't pretend that you didn't know that these things are happening. And he said that not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. And you've spoken to us loud and clear this evening, very movingly, powerfully, and why people should certainly read this book and tell more people themselves about what's happening in Xinjiang. Now let's go over to the floor. So the question is, what can we do about the prevalence of Chinese commodities, which are very cheap often, because of course they are made by slave labor, being sold in Spain, in Italy and elsewhere? What can we do about that? So by the Chinese, so that people have a real choice.
I'm not an expert on the European trade issues, but what I can say is that in the United States, with the enactment and hopefully with the full implementation of the Forced Labor Prevention Act, we will see a sea change. This is why the businesses are so uncomfortable, because essentially anything coming, any product coming to the United States from China, from that region, presumptively made by forced labor, unless it's proven with evidence by the businesses. So unless the governments in Europe put in place such a strong legislative mandate, this problem will not be able to handle. But I am very hopeful that in the United States we will see some significant changes in our trade practices.
Absolutely. I mean, it's worth mentioning that we spent £10 billion of British taxpayers' money during COVID, £1 billion just on lateral flow tests alone. And as Nury was saying, was it really impossible for us to manufacture those things here? Why is it that they're so cheap? Because if you use slave labor, you will always undercut your competitors if they pay reasonable salaries to people. So there are a lot of issues here about resilience, and also about really becoming reliant on sources that we should never have become reliant upon. So we're thinking about
the one quick comment, and that people often suggest that a certain government official or activist or reporter or politician picking a fight with China. Actually, what we're doing is responding. We're not the protagonist. They are forcing us to act. We give them enough time and chances to do it right, but they just polluting the global supply chain with slave labor produced products. So we have to act. That's what we're doing.
Person in front of them. Let's take the two together. So the gentleman in the striped, in the checked shirt. The question was really about the contrast between the way that, for instance, we failed to designate the Holodomor, the mass starvation of Ukrainians, 2 million died under Stalin, was not designated, nor were many of the other crimes against humanity in the former Soviet Union as a genocide. And then the parallels been drawn with some of the domestic things that might be violations of human rights, including decisions that might come as a result of judicial decisions.
Well, I've heard similar comments on a number of issues. I'm not an expert on the issue that you're raising, but what I can say is that I can go to the Lafayette Park every day, 7 days a week, protest chant anti-Biden or Trump previously slogan, and no one will take me into a camp or punish me or take away my rights. The point I'm making is that we have places that we can go to. In the cases of the Uyghurs, there's no place for them to go to file a complaint. That's number one. Number two, as a country, as a society, we have a moral obligation to speak up with all the faults and shortcomings that we have. So bringing up that kind of issues often to make the case against certain governments actually emboldens the genocidal regime in Beijing. We can be better by self-criticism or improvement in our home front. At the same time, we should feel comfortable to call out genocidal regimes.
Thank you. Of course, we have things called elections, which enable us to change governments as well when we don't like things that they do or say. Yeah. Gentleman in front. So the question is about realpolitik, it's about soft power and the role that religious freedom may play. I think that's a very good final question for us to end on. The question is about what is the turning point when people feel able to speak out, and especially young people, and especially maybe in our universities where we're seeing quite a lot of no platforming and controlling over free speech and preventing people from being able to talk about these issues. Nury, the last word now in response to those two questions.
Yes, on the soft power, the United States has made United States engagement policy in the last 5 decades has been a failure. As we have seen in the way that China has been acting repressively at home and aggressively abroad. When you look at the recent speech by Secretary Blinken, he put out 3 approach: invest, align, and compete. I think it's the right approach. But on the competition, we cannot just say we compete. We also have to invest on people. I think this is where the United States government has not been doing enough on the public diplomacy aspect. In the case of the Chinese individuals, and even some fair-minded, reasonable Chinese individuals that I have interacted, did not think that the Chinese government is committing those atrocities against their own citizens. A couple of years ago, former Deputy National Security Advisor Matt Pottinger made a speech in Chinese essentially saying, did you know, have you heard, your government is setting up a modern-day concentration camps in your backyard. That's the kind of message need to be told more often so that we will gain more support from a fair-minded, reasonable population who might be ignorant about what's happening now, but potentially it could be an ally in the effort to make improvement for the people and the lives in China.
So smart power rather than soft power, and a willingness to make sure that this message, the message contained in this book, gets out to a wider audience. I'd particularly congratulate the BBC for what they have done, and they've paid a price themselves for having been willing to speak out, and the documentaries that they have broadcast, the files that they recently brought to light. That all helps to break the information blockade. But so often, it will be your generation, I think, that will find smart ways around the information blockade to make sure the word does get out. One of the things that struck me on my last visit to China was talking to people at some of the universities that they knew what the truth was and what the reality was. They were fearful of what they could say and what they could do, but they were talking to one another and they were finding ways of getting hold of information. So I suspect whatever the CCP would like to do, while books like this are available in every good bookshop, there's no reason at all for everyone not to know the truth. Stand for truth, it's enough, said Ben Johnson, and I think that's a good note on which to end. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Nury. Thank you.